Chapter 11, The Misuse of Disfellowshipping, page 348. We are not dictators over your faith, but are fellow workers with you for your happiness. 2 Corinthians, chapter 1 verse 24, Jerusalem Bible. In both spirit and method, the Watchtower organization's disfellowshipping policy conforms far more to that of the religious leaders in power in the Jewish nation in the 1st century than to that of Christ and his apostles. The effects are often tragic. What this can and does produce is illustrated by a letter received from Annette Stewart, then a 77-year-old grandmother in West Brookfield, Massachusetts, who had been a witness for many years. The footnote reads, letter dated July 29, 1987. End of footnote. She related that when her granddaughter was 14, the girl's mother encouraged her to take the step of baptism as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. 3 years later, the girl made known her feelings that the pressures placed on her as a witness were too much. Elders were summoned and she was adamant in stating that she did not intend to go to any more meetings. The elders' decision was that since she had disfellowshipped herself, they had no other choice than to disfellowship her. At the time the organizational policy did not call for full shunning of disfellowshipped family members and, as Annette says, at least the family was still intact. Then, in 1981, the policy changed. Annette states, my granddaughter was now cut off from her family and relatives. I could not turn her out of our home. She needed us more than ever. Her mother honored the new rule. She had nothing more to do with her daughter or with me. That of course was her choice. 2 elders came to my home to give me a choice. They voiced the opinion that since my husband was not a JW they had no right to prohibit my granddaughter from coming to our home. My husband had brought that out to the elders previously. The elders told me I had to walk out of the room when my granddaughter came to visit. I was not to eat at the same table if she stayed to share a meal with my husband. In my mind what they asked me to do was unloving, inhuman, and not Christian. I told them I could not do what they asked. I remember crying bitterly at the time. They stood there frozen without compassion. At age 73, and after 30 years of association, the girl's grandmother was now also disfellowshipped. Her husband, who was never a witness, saw his family suddenly torn away from him. He wrote to the Watchtower headquarters for help but the elders' action was upheld. As Mrs. Stewart writes, my daughter, son, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, I have not set eyes on these beloved people for over 4 years. My son and daughter live in the same town as we do. My sin was having my disfellowshipped granddaughter in my home. How can such action possibly be justified on the claim that it contributes to keeping the organization clean? Is it not rather a demonstration of the position that no one can fail to heed the demands of organizational authority with impunity? The elders, in fact, informed Annette that she would be an example to others who feel they can break the rule. The headquarters organization supported their position. This grandmother in her 70s was indeed made to feel the weight of authority, a treatment that Jesus described as typical of the world, not of Christianity. Matthew, chapter 20 verse 25, the New English Bible. Just how devastatingly disruptive of family relationships the organization's rigid policy can be is demonstrated in the case of Richard Gehman and his family. A witness for 30 years, Gehman had come to have serious questions about certain Watchtower doctrines and this led to investigative meetings with elders. He found he had to suggest to the elders that the scriptures might be brought into the picture to resolve his questions. He writes, the answer was always the same, we have to recognize God's channel of communication. In 1982, the Wilmette Flat, New Hampshire, elders disfellowshipped Gehman for having such doubts. Some of his family members supported the excommunication action, others did not. In 1984, he described the ultimate result, saying, our own drama continues. On January 5, my wife and our 2 mothers, widows, ages 72 and 77, were disfellowshipped by the 3 elders of the Wilmette Flat congregation. This incalculable cruelty will cause them much heartache. The last thread of communication with our witness daughter is now severed. My wife will also lose contact with her two sisters and their families. My own mother will probably be shunned by her three granddaughters who remain as Jehovah's Witnesses. Saddest of all, my dear mother-in-law undoubtedly will be rejected by her two daughters, her 9 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. All of this done because of the rules of the Watchtower Society. There are hundreds, even thousands of similar cases today. Evidence that they are not some anomaly, or simply due to the narrow-mindedness of a few local elders, can be seen from a letter written by the Watchtower Society's service department to a young man in the Northeast whose father had been disfellowshipped, the only charge against him being that he did not accept as scriptural certain teachings of the organization. The son wrote to the Brooklyn headquarters saying that his sister and her husband now had no association with his father and he felt that this was disrespectful to his parents. The letter he received is here shown, his name and address being blocked out at his request for reasons of privacy. Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York. July 14, 1983. Dear Bold.1, equals, we have your letter in which you say that you are troubled by a problem that the elders seem unable to resolve. Your father has been disfellowshipped and as a result of this your sister and her husband do not have any association with your father. You seem to feel that this is disrespectful to your parents. It is most unfortunate to hear that your father has been disfellowshipped. His taking action that resulted in his being disfellowshipped has brought about a scriptural barrier between his and those loyal members of the family who continue to faithfully serve Jehovah. The loyal ones have not been the creators of the problem but rather, the one who is disfellowshipped has caused it. Therefore, it would not be appropriate on your part to find fault with your sister if she respectfully obeys the scriptural command at 1 Corinthians, chapter 5 verse 11. A person who is disfellowshipped has been spiritually cut off from the congregation, the former spiritual ties have been completely severed. This is true even with respect to relatives, including those within his immediate family circle. Thursday, family members while acknowledging family ties, will no longer have any spiritual fellowship with the disfellowshipped relative. 1 Samuel, chapter 28 verse 6, Proverbs, chapter 15 verse 8, 9, while you and your sister may find it necessary from time to care for necessary family matters in regard to your parents, the direction at 1 Corinthians, chapter 5 verse 11 would prohibit any association on a regular basis. We can appreciate that sentiment and family ties are particularly strong between parents and children but, in the final analysis, we will not benefit anyone or please God if we allow emotion to lead us into ignoring His wise counsel and guidance. We need to display our complete confidence in His perfect righteousness and ways, including His provision to dim fellowshipped unrepentant wrongdoers. If we remain loyal to God and the congregation, the wrongdoer in time may take a lesson from that, repent and be reinstated into the congregation. It is our hope that will be the case with your father. Faithfully yours. Thus, conscientious disagreement with any position or teaching of the organization supposedly classes this man with the one described at 1 Corinthians, chapter 5 verse 11, as a wicked man, categorized as on a level with sexually immoral persons, greedy persons, extortioners, and idolaters. The responsibility for the family division is all placed on him. Yet the undeniable fact is that in almost all such cases the division results, not from the personal conviction or feelings of the family members of the disfellowshipped or disassociated person, but solely because of the organizational policy laid out for them. This is obvious from the immediate change in attitude that witnesses worldwide made after the appearance of articles in the August 1, 1974, Watchtower which greatly moderated the position taken regarding the attitude of family members toward a disfellowshipped relative. The information was received gratefully by witness families. Then, in 1981, the earlier, harsh policy was reinstated. Disfellowshipped family members were again subject to great coldness, often totally cut off. The footnote reads: the moderating 1974 articles were written by me on assignment by the governing body. A nephew of mine who was disfellowshipped and whose parents and brother and sister had not conversed with him for years, was contacted by them as a direct result of these articles and soon thereafter reinstated. End of footnote. But if today that policy were again officially moderated, most witnesses would unhesitatingly renew family ties, particularly in those cases where their only reason for rejecting a family member is that he or she is simply in a disfellowshipped state and not because that one's present conduct causes them honestly to consider him or her as an evil or corrupting person. I cannot believe that Annette Stewart's family really believe their now 80-year-old grandmother to be such. And I think there is little question that in the great majority of cases witnesses neither wanted to adopt the rigid position they took, nor were they genuinely convinced of the rightness of it. It was something imposed upon them by the religious authority, and the responsibility for family division in all such cases rightly rests with that authority. The emotional suffering produced is incalculable. In the case of one disfellowshipped woman in Massachusetts, her mother, living in Maine, became gravely ill and died, in the mid-1980s. Though knowing this daughter's address, neither her witness family members nor the elders informed her of her mother's illness, her death, or the funeral. She first learned of it after her mother had already been buried. She stated that the torturing anguish resulting from being thus deprived of seeing her dying mother or of having any opportunity to express, or attempt to express, her love simply would not go away. How can any of this possibly be harmonized with the personality of a God of love and of his compassionate Son? Why should anyone feel drawn to a system contributing to such actions? Inflexible enforcement of organizational law. The manner in which elders apply watchtower policies clearly shows that they do indeed view them as law. The inflexible attitude produced, or, at the very least, condoned, by the organizational headquarters causes elders to view neither circumstance, age, health, years of association, nor any such factor as affecting the requirement of full compliance with all organizational rules, full acceptance of all its teachings. One example of the almost mindless rigidity so often created is the case of a witness in the state of Maine, David Haynes, who operated a security alarm service. Beginning in the 1970s and over a period of years, his business installed many burglar and fire alarm systems. Some of these were in churches and church schools. Then, in the 1980s came a request for him to meet with a congregational committee of 3 witness elders, Spear, Maddock, and Wentworth. They informed him that he could no longer continue such installation work in religious buildings, to do so would make him liable for disfellowshipping. He agreed to stop. Later, the elders informed him that he must also stop servicing the systems already installed. He told them he would comply and arranged for his service manager, not a witness, to go on his own time, as on a Saturday, and do such servicing, and also provided that this man would receive all the compensation involved. Even this was not satisfactory to the elders, however, for the systems were tied in with a central monitoring system at his business's office. The elders informed him that he could no longer monitor the systems installed in those churches and church schools without jeopardizing his standing in the congregation. He offered to see what he could do to transfer the monitoring to some other alarm service business, though this might take some time. He was granted a specific period. His business was going through some changes of equipment at the time, and this contributed to his not meeting the deadline set. He asked for an extension, telling the elders that he did not want to damage his business by peremptorily cutting off service to these customers. They granted him an additional month. When it was up, since he had not accomplished the transferal by that time, though he literally begged and pleaded for consideration and forbearance, he was disfellowshipped. He had been associated with the organization for 15 years. He appealed the decision of the local judicial committee, and in meeting with an appeal committee tried to reason with them, citing examples of those who work for the electrical power company or who install and service telephones and lines for churches. The footnote reads, in appeal cases, the appeals committees are usually selected and appointed directly by the service department in Brooklyn. End of footnote. The reply was that he did not have to supply his alarm service and that therefore they were upholding the disfellowshipping decision. The elders doubtless never allowed themselves to question whether any of this legalistic harassment really made sense, or how much it was like the critical viewpoint of the Pharisees in condemning the disciples for picking and eating some grains of wheat on the Sabbath. They quite likely focused on the thought that they were being loyal to the organization. Of a quite different nature, but illustrating the same attitude, is the case in 1982 of George West, an elderly witness associated with the Maynard, Massachusetts, Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. He developed bone cancer and in time deteriorated to the point of requiring hospitalization as a terminal case. His head was supported in a cage arrangement since his neck bones could no longer bear the weight. Local elders heard that George West had submitted to a blood transfusion and made several attempts to try to talk with him, in spite of his extreme condition and against his wife's wishes. Finally, one evening they succeeded in getting in to see her husband, and under interrogation he acknowledged having accepted the transfusion. His reason? His children from a previous marriage had heard he was dying and called to let him know they were coming from the Midwest to visit him at the hospital. He had not seen them since childhood. He decided to take the transfusion to extend his life a little longer in order to be reunited with his children. The footnote reads, "These facts were tinted in a letter to the editorial column of the Concord Monitor of December 8, 1984. No one did, or could, refute them." End of footnote. The elders disfellowshipped George West only days before he died. Again, what kind of mentality is it that could in any way say that such actions toward a man on his deathbed are in the least reflective of Christianity, or that they by any sane reasoning can be conceived as contributing toward a clean congregation? The only practical effect was that no funeral service by witnesses could be conducted for the man. And, for most witnesses, by his dying in a disfellowshipped state he would be viewed as not qualifying for a resurrection, having died outside the organization. Rather than cleanness, in reality, such action produces a stain of dishonor, for it is an action strongly colored with an unfeeling attitude more representative of Pharisaism, and its intense preoccupation with religious cleanness, than Christianity. It was as if the organization's representatives felt they would be remiss if they allowed the man to die without a disfellowship label affixed to his disease-crippled body. The question is once more rightly asked, who bears the primary responsibility for the attitude producing such actions? While there is much evidence that the spirit shown by different bodies of elders may vary widely, the blame for the rigid, unmerciful attitude shown in such cases simply cannot be passed off as related just to the particular elders involved. The frequency and widespread nature of this rigidity point to its having some central source. Since all disfellowshipping actions are reported to the headquarters organization, it is not unaware of what is happening. The pathetic case of Percy Harding illustrates this, for it took place virtually on the international headquarters doorstep. In 1910, when about 20 years old, Percy, a native of Western Canada, began reading the writings of Pastor Russell and in 6 months had read some 3,000 pages of material. He resigned from the Protestant church of which he was a member and found himself totally alone in his new belief among his townspeople. He began witnessing and formed 2 groups in the area and held baptisms at a nearby river. He writes, "In 1918 I quit a good job to become a colporteur. My territory covered hundreds of square miles, mostly along the railways, from southern Alberta to the Pacific coast. I also covered the country territory on foot, carrying 2 small bags of books. Often I walked as much as 15 to 25 miles a day. After 7 years of this activity, on May 25, 1925, he went to Brooklyn, New York, to serve at the Watchtower headquarters. After about 4 years, the attitude developing under the presidency of Rutherford, and the conduct of some exercising oversight left Percy disillusioned. In 1929 he terminated his work at the headquarters. Despite this, he remained associated and active with the same congregation in Brooklyn for the following 56 years. Of what then happened he writes, from May, 1925, until December, 1981, I remained in the same congregation until I was disfellowshipped for talking about God's word to a few of my friends. This was unbelievable, and, so far as the society is concerned, a disgraceful performance. The judicial committee had a letter from another board of elders in a different congregation. They had disfellowshipped a friend of mine. They questioned him at length about other people he had talked to about the Bible. He caved in and told them, mentioning my name among others. So this letter from the elders, including things I and others had said, was presented to me with a request that I comment on it. I told the committee that I had nothing to say, that what went on between me and my friends was strictly a private matter and was nobody else's business. They promised me a copy of the letter, but I never received it. Then they started asking questions, the most important being, do you believe that the society is God's organization and that it is bringing forth truth? So I said, there is nothing in God's word to indicate that God ever used an organization to bring forth truth. From Moses, down through all the prophets to John and the Revelation, it was always an individual. There were 3 committee meetings, the last being at Bethel. The night I was disfellowshipped, Harry Peloyan, a longtime member of the Watchtower's writing staff, made a speech at the Kingdom Hall, bringing a charge that was not even discussed in any of the committee meetings, that of disrupting the unity of the congregation. He misused 2 John verses 10 and 11, in instructing 175 people to cut me cold. After the meeting everyone filed out, passing me by like I was a leper. Percy was 91 years old and in poor health. Whether one may consider his understanding of certain scriptures as correct or mistaken, the fact remains that the issue arose, not because he was creating a disturbance, one that was congregationally evident, but because of private conversations with friends. No one in the congregation had complained of his being an agitator, and the matter became an issue only as the result of a letter from another congregation that initiated investigation and interrogation by elders into his private remarks on scriptural subjects among personal friends. Compare the accusation against the Apostle Paul and his defense at Acts, chapter 24 verse 5-13. On a trip to the Northeast in 1982, I visited Percy Harding at his home on 6th Street in Brooklyn. He sat, seemingly dwarfed by the large chair, a small, frail-looking man obviously weakened by age and illness. I asked myself how anyone in his right mind could view a person like that, having no position or particular influence, as constituting such a danger that, despite his some 70 years of association, it was deemed necessary that he be disfellowshipped and cut off from all his lifetime associates. I thought that an organization must be extremely unsure of itself, feel an incredible sense of vulnerability, to ever consider such a frail, aged man as a threat. Concerning the effect the disfellowshipping had on his personal circumstances, he writes, before this there were 2 witness nurses who visited me, almost every week. They did some things for me that I was unable to do for myself, and, more importantly, they were on call if I needed them. Since I will be 92 years old on August 18, who knows when an emergency may arrive. After I was disfellowshipped, I called one of the nurses. Her husband answered the phone and said, "Anne is not allowed to talk to you." Let me say again that the only thing the elders have against me is that I talked to a few of my friends about the Bible. In my conversations with Percy I found him to be a blunt-speaking man. He may well have been quite blunt in his discussions with the elders who judged him. But even if he had been more than blunt, had been caustic, even cantankerous, how could that possibly justify cutting off a 91-year-old man, single, ill, with no relatives within hundreds of miles, writing him off, along with his over 70 years of active association, as someone now to be ignored and forgotten? What heinous crime had he committed that could justify this? I find it difficult to understand how anyone claiming to be a disciple of the true shepherd of the sheep, Jesus Christ, could be party to such an action, one that in my mind merits no less description than heartless. Yet, as stated, it took place on the very doorstep of the world headquarters of the Watchtower Society. Percy is now dead, having died in his sleep on February 3, 1984. During the 25 months following his disfellowshipment, not a single person from the congregation with which he had been associated for 56 years came to see Hint or inquire of his needs. The footnote reads, "A friend of mine living in the New York area visited Hint on a weekly basis and eventually, when Percy's funds were running out, arranged for his gaining entrance to the nursing home where he died." End of footnote. The ultimate sin, disagreeing with the organization. Percy Harding's case is also illustrative of the organization's insistence on total acceptance of all of its teachings. Consider, then, these quotations from Watchtower representatives in which they state, "If someone doesn't want to live by our principles, he's free to leave. There's no badgering here, no physical or emotional harassment. We don't dictate from headquarters." The footnote reads, Walter Graham, Canadian branch, quoted to a Toronto newspaper. End of footnote. We're not spiritual policemen. We don't try to stifle anyone in his opinion. The footnote reads, traveling overseer, now a governing body member, Samuel Hurd, quoted in Chicago Tribune. End of footnote. If people do not want to stay, they are free to leave. I cannot understand why those disagreeing simply do not leave quietly. The footnote reads, Robert Balza, Watchtower Headquarters Public Relations Man. End of footnote. I am sure that all these men know that the picture they paint is not in accord with the reality. For they know what happens today when one of Jehovah's Witnesses endeavors to leave quietly. The actual situation is similar to that a soldier would face if he went to his commanding officer and said, "Sir, based on my conscience I have decided to leave, and I just wanted to let you know that I will go quietly and not disturb the troops in any way." Unless he quickly recanted, the consequences the soldier would face, dishonorable discharge or, in time of war, execution by a firing squad, are paralleled in a spiritual way by those Jehovah's Witnesses face. Those who think of quietly withdrawing know that they have a gun at their heads, the weapon being the threat of official disfellowshipment, or that of being officially pronounced disassociated, which is the same weapon, producing the same results, but under a different name. Though not physically placed before a firing squad, any witness attempting to leave the organization for conscientious reasons can do so only at the risk of being labeled heretical, unfit for true Christians, other Jehovah's Witnesses, to associate with, someone that even family members should treat as an outcast. The organizational policies allow no possible way to leave with honor. Only a person insensitive to human feelings could think that there is no emotional harassment involved. This situation has become particularly evident since 1980. Following the disfellowshipment of a few members of the headquarters staff for not fully accepting all Watchtower teachings, and also my resignation from the governing body, the direction now taken by the organization was exemplified by a letter to its traveling representatives, dated September 1, 1980. The footnote reads, a photocopy of this letter may be seen in Crisis of Conscience, pages 341, 342. End of footnote. That letter spelled out a policy that even to persist in, not talking about, but simply believing anything different from what the slave class provided constituted apostatizing and could lead to disfellowshipment. While it called on elders to be discreet and kindly in their inquiries as to members' personal beliefs, we have already seen, in the case of Percy Harding and other cases already cited, what this directive produced in the way of kindly, discreet inquiry. The letter opened the way for men inclined toward dogmatism and intolerance to vent those qualities in their dealings with the flock, and caused otherwise caring men to act unfeelingly. Simple questions resulting from lack of knowledge are allowed, even welcomed. But when questions are raised that are the result of serious investigation and knowledgeable thinking and that involve a questioning of any of the organization's teachings, the practice overwhelmingly is to attack the questioner and his or her motives rather than address the question. What had already taken place at the Brooklyn headquarters, documented in Crisis of Conscience, illustrates to what extent the qualities of kindness and discretion were displayed and how empty those expressions were. That headquarters example was thereafter reflected all over the United States and in many other lands. The objective has been to create a sterile atmosphere, where the organization's teachings and policies can circulate free from any risk of having to confront serious questioning or of having to overcome scriptural objections and adverse evidence. Is this overstated? Consider just a few examples, typical of scores of others. In Crisis of Conscience I related the disfellowshipment of Edward Dunlap who, after over 50 years of association, most of them spent in Bethel service, was in effect put out on the street at nearly 70 years of age, disfellowshipped for having expressed viewpoints in conversation among friends that did not conform to all of the organization's teachings. I mentioned his returning to the home city of his childhood, Oklahoma City, to take up his earlier trade of wallpapering along with his brother, Marion. What resulted from this? Marion Dunlap was then the appointed city overseer for the several congregations in Oklahoma City. He too had been a witness for nearly 50 years, always very active in field service and meeting participation. When he offered lodging and work to his 70-year-old disfellowshipped brother, Marion himself came under investigation. He was subsequently disfellowshipped and within about a year 5 other members of the Dunlap family were disfellowshipped. They were not persons engaging in wrongdoing of any kind, they had not sought to stir up trouble or engage in campaigning or protesting, they simply felt bound by conscience to let their beliefs be governed by the Word of God rather than by the word of fallible men or organizations. Another witness, a professor at Oklahoma State University, expressed himself as feeling it was a shame that anyone with Ed Dunlap's teaching ability should not have an outlet for that ability. He helped arrange for Ed to conduct some classes at the university. This brought him under the elders' scrutiny and he too was soon disfellowshipped. While it is true that in some of the cases those involved chose on their own to discontinue meeting attendance, this in no way reflected any desire on their part to cease friendship or conversation with their previous associates among Jehovah's Witnesses. It in no way implied any rejection by them of such persons or any adverse feelings toward them. The complete cutting off of relationships came solely from the aggressive actions of elders. The unusual zeal elders show in pursuing any suspected case of disaffection is illustrated in the actions taken at a little place in Mississippi called Dancy, small enough not to appear on most maps. The Walker family lived here and in the 1940s the mother and, later, 3 of her daughters became witnesses. In time, the Kingdom Hall was built just across the road from the Walker home, the land being donated by Ray Phillips, the husband of one of the daughters, who was also the builder of the hall. Sue Walker, one of the 3 daughters, became a pioneer and later graduated from the Watchtower's Missionary School, Gilead. She spent 12 years in missionary service in Bolivia under difficult conditions. In one assignment, a town on the edge of the jungle called Trinidad, she and her partner were totally separated from association with other witnesses. The low-lying town flooded during certain seasons and the only way to get around was by small boats. Sue recalls studying the Bible with a woman who always kept a stick by her side. She wondered why until one day a snake came up out of the water onto the porch and the woman calmly picked up the stick and knocked it back into the water. Sue and her partner stayed in the assignment, putting up with sickness and poor diet for years. In 1962, Sue was transferred from Bolivia to the Dominican Republic where my wife and I were stationed. Times were turbulent there, including a full-scale revolution in 1965, and more than once Sue had to take cover from gunfire when on her way home from conducting Bible studies. Though having health problems, to her 12 years of service in Bolivia she added another 13 years spent in the Dominican Republic. After these 25 years as a missionary, Sue felt it her duty to return to Dancy, Mississippi, to care for her aging parents, now in their 80s. Though she continued to pioneer on her return, she was distressed to find that many local witnesses viewed her as having quit her assignment. Rumors even circulated that she had been sent home by the Society for Wrong Conduct, which was totally false. I find it hard to believe that anyone knowing Sue Walker could speak thus of her. As branch overseer in both Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, I had had dealings with easily more than 100 missionaries. Of them all, none was less likely to give cause for complaint than Sue. Even-tempered, Not easily upset, she went about her work in an uncomplaining, quiet way. Few missionaries did as much personal Bible reading as she did. This, combined with actual experience over many years and in several countries, experience that brought home to her the degree to which the organization failed to reflect a truly Christian spirit, eventually caused her to reassess her conviction of its being God's sole channel and chosen instrument. Her sisters had reached a similar point of reassessment. What followed again illustrates quite graphically the way the organization's shepherding program so often functions when elders view members as straying from the flock. The first to draw their attention was Sue's niece, also named Sue, Phillips. Convinced that the Society's teachings did not accurately represent the first-century good news, she had quietly withdrawn from meeting attendance. A district overseer, a circuit overseer and a local elder visited her, questioning her for about an hour as to the reasons for her non-attendance. She explained her feelings, that she had been doing much personal study of the scriptures and could no longer conscientiously support some of the beliefs taught by the organization. She mentioned, among other things, the limiting of Christ's mediatorship to a special class and the impression created that salvation is something earned through specific works. As happens in thousands of similar situations, the manner of dealing with such questions is to focus, not on the scriptures, but on the organization. Thus, the local elder asked her, "Where did you learn what you know about God's purposes?" The customary and expected answer being, "From God's organization." But Sue replied, "From the Bible." They assured her that they studied more than she did and had their assigned positions in the organization. This was the essence of their counsel, principal stress being laid on the organization's importance, and they soon left. A few weeks after this shepherding visit, Sue returned from a trip and found a notice to appear for a judicial hearing that very day, January 3, 1982. She had arrived home seriously ill and entered the hospital that same day. It was 12 days before she recovered sufficiently to leave. During that time none of the local witnesses visited her, although 2 women witnesses phoned her mother to inquire about her. During the 12 days of her hospitalization, the congregational shepherds took the course of those in the parable to whom it is said, "I was sick and you never cared to visit me." The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 25 verse 43, Phillips Modern English. End of footnote. Sue returned home on a Friday. Exactly 2 days after leaving the hospital, on Sunday, a local elder phoned her to set up a new date for a judicial hearing. She informed him that she had no intention of going to such a hearing, having just left the hospital and still not well. The elder mentioned his having heard of her being in the hospital and said he was sorry to hear she had been ill. He went on to say that, if she would not attend the hearing, then, we may have to take some action. Sue replied, "Well, I guess you'll do whatever you want to do." His response, rather heated and quite emphatic, was, "We'll do whatever the organization tells us to do." 3 days later, Sue wrote a letter to the congregation and to those well known to her. In it she included these statements. "For over a year now I have been reading and studying God's Word, the Bible, very diligently. Never in my life have I devoted so much of my time, thought and prayer to Bible study. What I began to learn and to see has caused me to turn my whole life course around. The decisions I have made came after much study, thought and prayer. They were not overnight decisions. I love Jehovah God and Jesus Christ very dearly and I don't want to do anything that would displease them. I give my wholehearted support to the way of Christianity as the best, most rewarding way of life. I want no other lifestyle for myself. I accept the Bible as the inspired Word of God and as my guidebook to living. To me the good news about Jesus Christ, what He did for all mankind and what it will mean for all exercising faith in Him is the most wonderful, exciting news there is. For any Christian, loyalty to Jehovah God, Jesus Christ, the Bible, the good news and the way of Christianity must be given priority over everything else. My loyalty and support absolutely go to all these. After months and months of Bible study and much prayer, I came to the conclusion that the things I formerly believed were simply not scriptural. As a Christian, I saw there were changes to be made. There were simply some things I could no longer give my support to. A few days after receipt of the letter, the elders announced to the Manti congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, which meets in Dancy, that Sue Phillips had been disfellowshipped for conduct unbecoming a Christian. The footnote reads, "This is a standard expression, deliberately left vague to avoid legal problems." End of footnote. A note to this effect, signed only Manti congregation, was sent to her home. In all, the local elders and traveling overseers in their shepherding efforts had spent approximately 1.5 hours with this young woman who from childhood had been raised as a witness. They doubtless felt they had accomplished the extended, kindly efforts referred to in the Watchtower headquarters directive. Apparently the clear evidence her letter gave that she had deep respect for the scriptures and a sincere concern for pleasing God and Christ did not warrant any forbearance on the elders' part, any feeling that there was good reason for showing tolerant patience, or any thought that perhaps by a calm, gentle, non-confrontational approach they might resolve her questions. No time was lost in making official announcement that she was now no longer a fit associate for the congregation members. It is a frequent practice to imply in Watchtower publications that those who do not agree with the organization are motivated by such negative emotions as pride, rebelliousness, a desire to escape from door-to-door activity due to a lack of humility, and similar charges. I do not doubt that there may be some individuals of that kind. But I also know that this has proven completely without foundation in case after case. It certainly was obviously false regarding Sue Phillips' aunt, former missionary Sue Walker. In her more than 40 years of service, she had beyond question spent far more hours in going from door to door than anyone in the area, including the elders and traveling overseers. On returning from missionary service, she had continued in active association with the Manti congregation until this point, regularly attending meetings, actively engaging in witnessing and in conducting home Bible studies with interested persons. In view of the organizational dealings with her niece, however, she felt matters had reached a stage calling for a decision. As she told her niece, "I'm the next one they'll come after." So, she wrote a letter of resignation and on Sunday walked out of her house and crossed the road to the Kingdom Hall and personally handed a copy to each of the elders. Sue Walker was then 63 years of age. She had spent 42 of those years as a witness, 35 of them in full-time service, and 25 of these in missionary work in foreign countries. She had foregone marriage and children, had endured many privations, had labored in primitive areas, had steadily sought to live a life in close harmony with Bible principles. Would it not be normal to wish to retain such a person in a congregation, to feel that it would be a definite loss no longer to have her association and example? If one felt that the witness beliefs were indeed sound and solidly based on Scripture, would one not feel moved to make whatever effort might be possible at least to continue contact with such a person with a hope of eventually reconciling differences? I would think so. But the organization-trained elders evidently did not. After receiving her letter, they made no effort to discuss its contents with her, punctually announced her official disassociation, and, due to the organizational policy, from that time forward Sue Walker in effect became a non-person for the congregation members, not to be spoken to or associated with. This is all the more remarkable in that Sue Walker continued to help her aged mother cross the road to the Kingdom Hall whenever she expressed the wish, quietly sitting through meetings with her mother, though her presence was not acknowledged by any in attendance, doing this entirely out of consideration for her mother's remaining as a witness. When her mother's health eventually caused her to give up meeting attendance, she rarely received any visits from congregation members, due to their reticence to being brought into contact with the disassociated daughter. Her mother's opinion of the organization changed, and when her husband, never a witness, died, she joined with her daughters in asking me to travel there to conduct the funeral. Before she herself died, she expressed the wish that I conduct her funeral as well. In a small rural community where everyone knows everyone else, The 100 or so persons who came to the funeral could not help but notice that, although their neighbor, Mrs. Walker, was not disfellowshipped nor had ever disassociated herself, none of the witnesses with whom she had worshipped for more than 40 years were in attendance. Organizational policy, not personal sentiments, kept them away. What followed Sue Walker's disassociation announcement is, if anything, even more revealing of the organizational spirit fostered. Some months earlier, her older sister Lulu and her husband, parents of Sue Phillips, had moved from the Dancy area to Mississippi's Gulf Coast area. Because of having arrived at conscientious conclusions about the organization, and being fully aware of the probable consequences of this, they purposely did not advise the Manatee elders of their future address and, on arrival at their new location in Long Beach, purposely sought to remain incognito as regards the congregation there. They hoped thus to withdraw quietly, avoid confrontational interrogation and the unpleasantness of judicial proceedings. They were thus surprised when, not long after the Manatee congregation disfellowshipped their daughter, 2 elders from the Long Beach, Mississippi, congregation, complete strangers to them personally, unexpectedly showed up at their door, unannounced. How these men knew of them can only be surmised, but the elders' statements made clear that it was a follow-up on the judicial action taken hundreds of miles away with regard to their daughter. The elders' shepherding efforts consisted of questioning Ray and Lulu Phillips as to their beliefs, asking if they felt the same as their daughter did. They replied in the affirmative. Within days came a notice to attend a judicial hearing. They had no wish to undergo that experience and said so. They, too, were disfellowshipped. One wonders what possible way there is for anyone to leave quietly as society representatives, including Robert Balzer of the Brooklyn headquarters, argue they should. The claim that such pursuit by elders is necessary to keep the organization clean seems especially hollow, in view of the fact that this couple in their late 60s were endeavoring to live quietly and unnoticed, with no connection with any congregation when the action was taken. One of Mrs. Walker's 3 witness daughters now remained, Lavinia, a very mild-mannered person then living in the New Orleans, Louisiana, area. When first moving there, Lavinia had attended a few meetings at the local Kingdom Hall but, like her sister Lulu, had decided to withdraw quietly. During the same time her sister in Mississippi was being investigated, she received a visit from a local elder accompanied by a visiting circuit overseer, coming to inquire about her lack of meeting attendance. She explained why she was not attending. No one can question the propriety of these men showing interest in her or, believing as they did that her spiritual welfare was at risk, they're endeavoring to encourage her to attend their meetings. That interest is certainly understandable, even commendable. What they actually did, however, is puzzling indeed. On hearing her explanation as to why she was not attending, the circuit overseer wrote out a short statement and said that if she did not plan to attend any more, as the wording of the statement read, she could simply sign it. She did. The result? She was now considered officially disassociated, to be viewed the same as if she had committed some act calling for excommunication, no longer to be talked to or associated with. The shepherding efforts, portrayed in Watchtower publications as extended loving efforts at readjusting and recovering strayed sheep, had taken at most 1 hour. Yet Lavinia had been associated for some 30 years. In all, the time of witness association of these 5 family members totaled some 200 years. The time spent by witness elders in supposed efforts to restore them to the flock amounted at most to a total of 5 or 6 hours. Surveillance and use of an informer system put no trust in a friend, have no confidence in a loved one, guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your embrace. Micah, chapter 7 verse 5, New Revised Standard Version. This same pattern has been repeated again and again, in place after place, country after country. Witnesses feel duty-bound to report on fellow witnesses who may deviate from organizational policies or teachings. In an article titled, A Time to Speak, When, the Watchtower of September 1, 1987, sets forth the official position that even where it means violating existing standards, even an oath of confidentiality, as in the case of a doctor, hospital nurse, lawyer, or other person privy to confidential records or information. A witness has the responsibility to reveal infractions of the organization's rules by another member if these involve what are often called disfellowshipping offenses. The offender is to be counseled to confess his or her infraction to the elders, but if this is not done, then the witness, knowing of the infraction, is told that loyalty to God requires him or her to report the matter to the elders. In only one area is confidentiality viewed as sacrosanct, and that is when it comes to the organization's own matters, including meetings held by elders in judicial hearings. The footnote reads, "Actually, it is a not infrequent fact that elders' wives learn of the cases they discuss." End of footnote. Incredible as it may seem, less than 4 years after this policy was instituted, in an article on coping with hospitalization, The Awake magazine of March 8, 1991, page 7, published a patient's Bill of Rights, and among these rights listed this: 6. Expect that all communications and records pertaining to his care will be treated as confidential. As we have seen, the organization's policy nullifies this right if it interferes with its rule that any witness having knowledge of another's infraction of its rules should reveal this, despite his or her being a doctor or nurse. An article by Dr. Gerald L. Bullock, of Plano, Texas, published in Medical Economics of August 19, 1985, makes plain that witnesses do indeed feel compelled to act as informers to elder bodies, despite the seriousness of the consequences not just to themselves but to others. Dr. Bullock relates that he hired a young witness woman who had been his patient and a family friend for years. He describes Tony, a name he gives her, not her real name, as a good and cheerful worker. All was fine until another witness woman, whom he calls Linda, and who was known by Tony, came to his office. She claimed that she was raped by several men after going to a bar in Houston, Texas, and had contracted gonorrhea. She had visited another doctor and now wanted a follow-up culture done to see if she was free from the disease. He felt it was not his position to question the truth of her rape claim and simply performed the culture, finding her free of infection. A few weeks later, Linda phoned him, angrily informing him that she had been disfellowshipped and was now shunned by her own family. She threatened a lawsuit, saying she was certain Tony had been the supplier of information to the elders about her case, taking the information from Dr. Bullock's office records. He states, "I was stunned. I couldn't believe that Tony would gossip about a patient. I'd gone into confidentiality at length before hiring her. And my personnel manual specifies the penalty of immediate termination for an employee who violates patient confidence." When I confronted Tony, I was even more stunned at her open admission that she was indeed the talebearer. She explained that in her religion every member is expected to report to church elders any other member who violates its teachings and discipline. When she reviewed Linda's chart for charges and insurance information and read what Linda had told me, she spent some time deciding where her primary loyalty lay. In the end, she took the story to the elders. It may be noted that, in her meditation on loyalty, she did not decide that she had an obligation to her employer and friend to inform him what she was going to do with information from his office records. Her witness training evidently did not cause that to appear to her as germane to the issue of loyalty. Dr. Bullock continues, "At least it hadn't simply been thoughtless gossip. However, that might have been easier for me to deal with than the fact that a trusted employee and friend had done such a thing after full consideration of the damage it would do, to a patient of ours and to me." Yet I found Linda's story of the public denunciation almost incredible. All the witnesses I knew seemed so kind. I couldn't believe that their religion called for such tale-bearing and harsh retribution for backsliders. I telephoned a leading elder of the church, who'd been a friend since high school. He told me it was all true. He explained that the church elders hadn't tried to weigh the truth of Linda's story of rape. As they saw it, she'd gone somewhere she shouldn't have gone, done something she shouldn't have done, and caught a disease she shouldn't have caught. For that, she had to suffer the punishment of disfellowshipment, to be lifted only if she could satisfy the elders of her true repentance. The church had even ordered her to move out of her family home until she met the requirements for absolution. If I'd been angry when I called, I was furious by the time the elder finished his explanation. I asked him if he realized what his church had done to me, an innocent bystander. He said he was sorry, but, like Tony, he felt the teachings of the church had to come before all other considerations. Like Tony, he, and the other elders, apparently did not feel any moral obligation to notify the doctor that they had received confidential information from his employee or the use they proposed to make of such legally privileged information. Their witness training simply did not cause them to think in those terms. On his attorney's advice, Dr. Bullock found it necessary to dismiss Tony. He not only explained to her why this must be done, but considerately did not let her action cause him to cease friendship toward her. He apologized to Linda, explaining what had happened. She assured him that she would not sue since she recognized that he was not personally at fault. Dr. Bullock practices in another town now, but says he is still a little gun-shy. He writes that, since breach of patient confidentiality by an employee is not covered by medical malpractice insurance, all our expensive professional liability insurance wouldn't be worth a nickel if a patient victimized in this fashion were to sue and win. He now carries a business owner's policy that includes heavy personal liability coverage for his employees. Each new employee is told the story of Tony and Linda, and if they cannot assure that their religious beliefs would not oblige them to betray a patient's confidentiality, he does not hire them. As basis for this insistence that witnesses must inform elders of infractions by fellow members, even in violation of confidentiality, the Watchtower earlier referred to cites the Mosaic law provision contained at Leviticus, chapter 5 verse 1, which says, "Now in case a soul sins in that he has heard public cursing and he is a witness, or he has seen it or has come to know of it, if he does not report it, then he must answer for his error." The article then draws these conclusions. This command from the highest level of authority in the universe put the responsibility upon each Israelite to report to the judges any serious wrongdoing that he observed so that the matter might be handled. While Christians are not strictly under the Mosaic law, its principles still apply in the Christian congregation. Hence, there may be times when a Christian is obligated to bring a matter to the attention of the elders. True, it is illegal in many countries to disclose to unauthorized ones what is found in private records. But if a Christian feels, after prayerful consideration, that he is facing a situation where the law of God required him to report what he knew despite the demands of lesser authorities, then that is a responsibility he accepts before Jehovah. There are times when a Christian must obey God as ruler rather than men. Acts, chapter 5 verse 29. While oaths or solemn promises should never be taken lightly, there may be times when promises required by men are in conflict with the requirement that we render exclusive devotion to our God. When someone commits a serious sin, he, in effect, comes under a public curse from the one wronged, Jehovah God. Deuteronomy, chapter 27 verse 26, Proverbs, chapter 3 verse 33, all who become part of the Christian congregation put themselves under oath to keep the congregation clean, both by what they do personally and by the way they help others to remain clean. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, September 1, 1987, page 13. End of footnote. This certainly lays a heavy burden on the individual witness, and the writer of the article endeavors to convey an equally heavy sense of guilt to any who do not report the sins of fellow witnesses to the organizationally appointed elders. Cleanness of the congregation is emphasized as the overriding factor justifying the position taken. But cleanness for witnesses is determined by organizational rulings, whether the scriptures speak on the matter or are silent, and the procedure for helping others to remain clean is also prescribed by the organization and its procedural rules. This is what makes so ominous the insistence that all members view themselves as under oath to keep the congregation clean. In its justifying the violating of confidentiality, the Watchtower article uses as an illustration the case of an unwed witness woman submitting to a hospital abortion. However, as has been seen in Chapter 8, with a multitude of organizational rules and regulations. The extent and variety of possible infractions calling for reporting could run into the hundreds. It could mean that a witness working for an accounting office who saw from invoices that a witness business owner had put a roof on a church, or installed an alarm system in a church, would view it as mandatory that the matter be reported to the elders. It could mean bringing accusation against a man for having accepted an assignment to work in an old people's home in place of taking military training, or for spreading insecticide in a military base, or against a woman for earning money by making beds in a barracks. It can mean feeling that one is under oath to report to the elders if a fellow witness expresses inability to accept the teaching that Christ's kingdom began in 1914, or that he is the mediator for only about 8,600 people today. While the article states that Christians are not strictly under the Mosaic law, one wonders how a stricter application of this particular law could possibly be made to Christians today than that set forth by the writer of the article. The distinction made between law and principle becomes a distinction without a difference. The fact is that Christians are not just not strictly under the Mosaic law, they are not under it partially or otherwise, but fully under God's gracious kindness. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 6 verse 14, Galatians, chapter 5 verse 4, 18. End of footnote. The article does not merely apply the principle of this regulation, which might be said to be one serving the interests of justice and righteousness, but applies the letter of the law, in contradiction to the apostolic teaching. But now we have been discharged from the law, because we have died to that by which we were being held fast, that we might be slaves in a new sense by the Spirit, and not in the old sense by the written code. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 7 verse 6, the New World Translation. End of footnote. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. The footnote reads, 2 Corinthians, chapter 3 verse 6, the New Revised Standard Version. End of footnote. The Watchtower application made is more reflective of the Judaizing attitude, with its effort to convert Christians into law-keepers, against which Paul labored so intensively, than it is of the Spirit of Christ. The Apostle warns that this law-keeping would make Christians subject to the very curse that the Watchtower article points to in its seeking to induce guilt in any not supporting its policies. The footnote reads, Acts, chapter 15 verse 5, Galatians, chapter 3 verse 1-5, 10-13. The article even includes a reference to Deuteronomy, chapter 27 verse 26, which states, Cursed is the one who will not put the words of this law in force by doing them. 18. The Watchtower, September 1, 1987, page 13. End of footnote. To achieve this application, the article actually goes beyond even what was contained in the Mosaic law. The article first states that what is dealt with at Leviticus, chapter 5 verse 1 is a legal case where a wrong has been committed and the one wronged calls on witnesses to give testimony, calling a curse on the one wronging him. In a footnote, it quotes the following, somewhat different, explanation. In their commentary on the Old Testament, Kiel and Delitzsch state that a person would be guilty of error or sin if he knew of another's crime, whether he had seen it, or had come to the certain knowledge of it in any other way, and was therefore qualified to appear in court as a witness for the conviction of the criminal, neglected to do so, and did not state what he had seen or learned, when he heard the solemn adjuration, the curse referred to of the judge at the public investigation of the crime, by which all persons present, who knew anything of the matter, were urged to come forward as witnesses. The footnote reads, Deuteronomy, chapter 16 verse 18, 21 verse 19, Ruth 4 verse 1. End of footnote. In Israel, which functioned as a distinct nation, handling not only misdemeanors and criminal cases, but also civil cases involving all manner of controversies between individuals, village or city elders acted as a court, with their consideration of cases held in public at the city gate. The footnote reads, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18, and chapter 21, verse 19. Also Ruth, chapter 4, verse 1. End of footnote. If there was any calling for witnesses to give testimony in a particular case, it was done in a public way, and the call might be accompanied by a solemn adjuration, or, as the New World Translation puts it, a public cursing, placing witnesses under responsibility to testify and to testify forthrightly. The footnote reads, compare Proverbs, chapter 29 verse 24, Matthew, chapter 26 verse 62, 63. End of footnote. One of the more detailed examples of a hearing before city elders is found at Ruth 4 verse 1 to 12. It deals with Boaz, a near relative of the deceased Elimelech, and interested in acting as repurchaser of the dead man's estate, the effecting of which would carry with it the obligation to marry Ruth the Moabitess. Boaz goes to the city gate, waits till another man who is the nearest relative, and who thus has first right as repurchaser, comes along. Boaz then gets together 10 of the elders of the city, and the matter is settled before them and the gathered crowd, with Boaz gaining the right he sought. He calls on all, elders and gathered people, saying, "You are witnesses today." There is not the remotest correspondence between the very open way matters were conducted then and the secretive way in which the religious court system instituted by the Watchtower organization operates. Public calls for witnesses are virtually unheard of, judicial hearings are carried on in secret, and about the only thing ever expressed publicly is a brief announcement of disfellowshipment or disassociation. Why does the organization make a very selective application of the principle of the law, using it only to place a burden of responsibility on its members to report on infractions of fellow members, while ignoring the clear principle of openness in the conduct of judicial proceedings by its organizationally appointed representatives? The footnote reads, its own 1988 publication Insight on Scriptures states that the publicity that would be afforded any trial at the gate would tend to influence the judges toward care and justice in the trial proceedings and in their decisions. Volume 1, page 518. End of footnote. The writer of the Watchtower article thus quickly seeks to convert the matter from the responding to a public call for witnesses, to that of an individual's initiating a report of wrongdoing to elders. The material relegates those not elders to the role of informers or accusers, and reserves to the elders any exercise of personal judgment as to what course the situation calls for. While members are supposed to approach the supposed wrongdoer first and urge his or her going to the elders, the fact is that this is rarely done. In the vast majority of cases that step is bypassed, a report is made to the elders, and, as the saying goes, this usually means that the fat is in the fire and the organization's judicial procedures begin to function. The whole intent of the Watchtower material evidently is to take from witness members any personal choice in the matter, any right to exercise personal judgment as regards making the wrong actions of another a matter subject to judicial inquiry. It seeks to rule out an individual's allowing compassion or any similar concern to determine whether he or she will keep such a matter confidential or not, as well as to portray as disrespectful to God any personal effort at helping the wrongdoer without making a report to the organization's appointed elders. There is no question that under the Mosaic Law there was an implicit responsibility to speak up about certain grave wrongs and crimes of an extreme nature, blasphemy against God, the attempt to seduce fellow Israelites to idolatry, the shedding of innocent human blood, perhaps also the uttering of false and deceptive prophecies. The footnote reads, Leviticus, chapter 24 verse 10 to 14, Deuteronomy, chapter 13 verse 6 to 11, 17 verse 2 to 7, 21 verse 1 to 9, Zechariah, chapter 13 verse 2 to 6. Generally, those knowing of such crimes were to be, not only witnesses, but the first in casting stones to execute such ones. End of footnote. But nowhere in the Mosaic Law do we find it stated in such broad terms that every Israelite was duty-bound to report to the judges any serious wrongdoing that he observed. As we have seen, in most cases, the regulations, including that at Leviticus, chapter 5 verse 1, deal with responding to a summons or an adjuration to testify, not an Israelite's initiating some report. The idea that God's law imposed on each Israelite the obligation to go to the city elders about each and every wrong of any significance that a fellow Israelite might commit with a consequent airing of the matter publicly at the city gate is something the Watchtower writer has read into the scriptures. Obviously, Any individual who was himself aggrieved, having been wronged by another, had the right to go to the elders at the gates and bring accusation. Even here, however, if individuals could work matters out privately, there was no obligation resting on the aggrieved one to report the wrongdoing of the other. A notable example of remaining silent in the face of apparently convincing evidence of serious wrong is found in the case of Joseph, Jesus' foster father. He genuinely believed that the woman betrothed to him had violated the law concerning adultery. The undeniable fact of her pregnancy before entering the marriage state appeared to give absolute proof of this. Yet Joseph did not feel under obligation to report her to elders or priests as judges. Not wanting to expose her to public disgrace, he intended to divorce her quietly. Was he thereby disdaining a divine oath commanding him to report and displaying a gross lack of concern for the cleanness of the congregation? The scriptures tell us he was so motivated because he was a righteous man, a good man, Phillips Modern English, a man of honor, the Jerusalem Bible. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 1 verse 19. End of footnote. In relieving Joseph of his misapprehension and assuring him of Mary's chastity, God did not rebuke him for his compassionate intent. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 1 verse 20 to 24. End of footnote. God's Son likewise made clear that not all wrongs needed to be brought before judges, speaking of circumstances where a wrongdoer might avoid this by coming to terms with his accuser even while the accuser was on his way to level the charge before the judge. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 6 verse 23 to 25. End of footnote. He correspondingly called on those who had been sinned against to take the initiative, not to report the matter to a judicial body, but to approach the one who had sinned and endeavor to get him to recognize the wrong, saying that, if successful, you have won back your brother, this without any intervention by others, including elders. Only if unsuccessful would he seek help from one or two others, and nothing is said of these being elders. If this further effort failed, then only would the sinful act of the wrongdoer be brought before the congregation. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 18 verse 15 to 18, the Jerusalem Bible. End of footnote. Jesus forcefully exposed the wrongness of the rigidity typifying a legalistic approach to service of God. Showing that the purpose of the law was to benefit man, not to be a wearisome burden, nor to fetter him in showing compassion, he told accusers that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The footnote reads, Mark, chapter 2 verse 27, the Jerusalem Bible. End of footnote. He recalled to religious legalists the account about David's entering the tabernacle and receiving loaves of the sacred bread of the presence to feed his men, bread which it was not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priests. The footnote reads, 1 Samuel, chapter 21 verse 1 to 6, Matthew, chapter 12 verse 1 to 4, the New Revised Standard Version. End of footnote. He neither portrayed David as coming under God's curse for doing this, nor portrayed the priest on that occasion as remiss in fulfilling an oath to keep the congregation clean because of not bringing an accusation against David. He likewise did not commend the action of Doeg the Edomite, who did promptly report the matter to the head of the nation, Saul, leading to a death sentence for 85 priests and the slaughter of the people in their city. The footnote reads, 1 Samuel, chapter 21 verse 7, 22 verse 9 to 19. End of footnote. Instead, Jesus used the account as basis for saying to the religious elders, if you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 12 verse 7, New International Version. End of footnote. As Christians, discharged from the law and no longer slaves in the old sense by the written code, we are free to be guided by Christ's example and by the law of faith and the royal law of love in making decisions in this area. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 7 verse 6. End of footnote. We have the apostolic assurance that he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law, and that not only commandments about adultery, murder, stealing, coveting, but whatever other commandment there may be, are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 13 verse 8 to 10, New International Version. End of footnote. We are free to use our judgment as to what course seems to give promise of bringing the greatest good for wrongdoers and for others who may be affected. Certainly there are matters in life of such grave import, either representing a grossness and severity of injury committed, or indicating a potential for serious harm, that, aware of them, we will feel moved to make them known to others. But we are not bound by inflexible rules, placing us under oath and making it automatically mandatory that we expose the trespasses of others. We are encouraged to confess our sins to one another, not to an ecclesiastical court. Each of us, not just men holding an organizational appointment, are exhorted to do whatever we can to help and heal those who have strayed from truth and fallen into error, doing so with a merciful attitude toward the individual, even though detesting the wrongs themselves. The footnote reads, James, chapter 5 verse 16-19-20, Jude, verses 22-23. End of footnote. The rigid policy advanced in the final analysis actually works against helping persons who slip into error. One committing a serious sin may feel keenly the need for help to avoid further wrong. But a witness cannot go even to a friend in his congregation to discuss a sinful error with any degree of assurance that what he or she says to the friend will be kept confidential. Texts speaking against the uncovering of confidential talk are not viewed as having force in this case, and the statement that a true companion is loving all the time, and is a brother that is born for when there is distress likewise becomes inoperative, empty of meaning. The footnote reads, see Proverbs, chapter 11 verse 13, 25 verse 9, 17 verse 17. End of footnote. Even though the one who has sinned has gone to God in prayer through Christ and sought forgiveness, this is not enough to warrant confidentiality. If the sin is anything the organization classifies as a major sin, its officials must be informed and the ecclesiastical court must decide whether action needs to be taken or not. Witnesses are made to feel that they are not showing love if they fail to report fellow members who have not gone to the authorities about their personal wrongs. Erring witnesses are told that they can speak to the elders, confident that they will handle the problem in a kind and understanding way. The footnote reads, quoted from the caption accompanying the picture on page 15 of the Watchtower, September 1, 1987. End of footnote. While on the governing body, quite a different picture from that portrayed came through in expressions from the headquarters service department. They quoted traveling overseers as saying they believed that by far the majority, some gave figures of 70% or more, of the elders were not qualified to serve in a judicial capacity. I am sure there are some elders who merit the confidence described in Watchtower publications. But actual experience shows that adherence to organizational policy is paramount with the great majority of such men, and that legalism all too often stymies the natural feelings of compassion they might otherwise have. Illustrative of the way the private actions of witnesses are closely monitored by loyal elders, men impelled to enforce the organization's great body of theocratic law, is the case in Sweden of Rud Persson and his wife. Rud was baptized as one of Jehovah's Witnesses in 1959. In January of 1986, he and his wife thought more seriously on the message of Christ Jesus in the parable of the Good Samaritan than they had done in the past. Moved especially by the hunger situation in Ethiopia, they paid a small annual membership fee to the Red Cross so as to obtain information about various emergency projects, among which they might choose to contribute some modest help. Rud expected no problem on this. His own mother, a staunch witness, had benefited from Swedish Red Cross invalid service after becoming permanently ill. A few months later, in May of that year, the presiding overseer of the local congregation approached Rud and inquired if he had joined the Red Cross. Rud expected a friendly conversation, but on his confirming that he had taken membership, the overseer dropped the subject and made no further inquiry. Only later did Rud find that an investigation had already begun before this conversation. One elder, having heard a rumor that Rudd had taken membership in the Red Cross, reported the matter to the body of elders. The elders had discussed the matter and had even contacted the circuit overseer of their area, Gert Anderson, for his advice. Why? It was felt that Rudd might have broken his neutrality as regards war, as we have seen, often expressed as having violated Isaiah, chapter 2 verse 4. The elders, on June 19, 1986, wrote to the Watchtower's Swedish branch office, inquiring as to the advisability of calling Rudd before a judicial committee to see if he had violated his Christian neutrality. The branch office replied, sending a copy of their letter to Circuit Overseer Anderson, saying they would research the matter and possibly obtain advice from the governing body in Brooklyn. Finally, on October 15, 1986, they sent the letter here shown to the presiding overseer of the congregation, Mats Nordsund. The footnote reads: "This letter was written in Swedish. What appears here is a translation. A copy of the Swedish original is on tile with commentary press." End of footnote. During all this time, from the occasion in May when the overseer's brief inquiry was made as to whether Rudd had joined the Red Cross, until now in October, nothing had been said to him about this investigation. Rudd's father and younger brother were on the body of elders but said nothing to him, doubtless feeling that confidentiality did not permit his being made aware that he might face a judicial hearing. However, when they received the branch office letter of October 15, the elders, having consulted the circuit overseer again, acted rapidly. On October 18, the presiding overseer phoned Rudd, informing him that the society wanted him to answer 5 questions in the presence of 2 elders. He also asked if Rudd's wife had become a Red Cross member. To the body of elders in the Perstorp congregation: "Dear brothers, we now write to you concerning the information you provided the society that Brother Rudd person has become a member of the Red Cross. We forwarded the issue to the brothers in Brooklyn to get their view on membership of such an organization. The brothers advised us that even if the Red Cross in a certain country carries out the service that may be needed locally, it still applies the principles of the International Red Cross with headquarters in Switzerland. It is claimed that the purpose of the organization is to relieve human hardship and suffering, but we must, nevertheless, remember that the organization had its beginning on the battlefields. It performs a large part of its work directly or indirectly in conflict with the thoughts outlined at Isaiah, chapter 2 verse 4. 2. The organization is one of the world's biggest suppliers of blood for transfusions. It is also involved in political matters and often acts as mediator between nations at war. Consequently, it is good to consider what an organization as a whole works for and put that in relation to the Christian neutrality that God's people must show. And we cannot support misuse of blood either. To be sure, it is all very well to try to relieve human suffering, but we don't need to become members of a worldly organization to do so, do we? This was treated rather extensively in the Watchtower, October 1, 1986, pages 22 to 24. A person's motive for joining an organization also comes into the picture. Why does he wish to join a certain organization? Does he approve of what the organization stands for? It may happen that someone becomes a passive member of such an organization in order to qualify for a course in first aid. Nothing else is required of the individual. A Christian might think that his conscience allows for this. On the other hand, if someone says that he is defending everything the organization advocates, then, of course, his privileges in the congregation would be affected. If someone should become a member and actively support, for example, the worldwide blood program the Red Cross stands for, that could lead to disfellowshipping. Hence, in your case we recommend that you talk to Brother Rudd person about this and examine his motive for joining the Red Cross. Is he of the opinion that what this organization stands for is good and proper? Is he aware of its program in support of blood transfusions and its activities as mediator between nations? When you have talked extensively with him about this and heard his reaction, Please communicate with us again so that we can visualize his thinking in this matter and if he wants to continue his membership of the Red Cross. What is his attitude to food containing blood served at school? Has he informed the teachers about our position regarding this? Birthday celebrations and so forth in connection with school activities. We mention this because Brother Gert Anderson at one time made comments about this concerning the children of Brother Rudd Person. United with you in publishing the good news of the kingdom, we send our love and greetings. Your brothers. Stamped, Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. At the meeting, Rudd was called on to answer these 5 questions. What is your motive for joining the Red Cross? 2. Are you of the opinion that what the Red Cross stands for is good and proper? 3. Are you aware of the program of the Red Cross for blood transfusions? 4. Are you aware that the Red Cross is involved in mediation between the nations? 5. Do you intend to continue your membership of the Red Cross? His replies, in essence, were these. 1. His motive was to be informed of help projects of the Red Cross and to make appropriate contributions. He referred the elders to an article in the December 8, 1976, Awake, which, while presenting many negative factors about charitable organizations, stated that it was not necessarily wrong to contribute to them. He also said he found the matter analogous to the organization's stand regarding labor unions and certain types of employment, where negative factors were viewed as balanced out by positive ones. The footnote reads, see the Watchtower, February 15, 1961, page 128, Awake. December 8, 1976, pages 27, 28, The Watchtower, July 15, 1982, page 26. End of footnote. 2. His answer to the second question was that he sympathized with the impartial help the Red Cross gave to the needy, felt it was good and proper. He then called the elders' attention to the statement in the June 1, 1918, issue of the Watchtower. A Christian to whom may have been presented the perverted viewpoint that the Red Cross work is only the aiding of that killing which is against his conscience, cannot help the Red Cross. Then he gains the broader viewpoint that the Red Cross is the embodiment of helping the helpless, and he finds himself able and willing to help the Red Cross according to ability and opportunity. He added that he felt this change from a perverted viewpoint to a broader viewpoint was even more justified today. 3. As regards blood transfusions, he pointed out that in most cases the actual transfusions are made by hospitals, and that he felt it unlikely that the society would boycott hospitals because of their large use of blood. Many witnesses worked at hospitals having blood programs. He reminded the elders of the society's ruling that a witness doctor might administer a blood transfusion to a non-witness patient requesting one, without being subjected to judicial action. The footnote reads, see the Watchtower, November 15, 1964, pages 682, 683. End of footnote. 4. As for alleged mediation between nations, he stated that the Red Cross was not political, its role as mediator being restricted solely to humanitarian matters. He again used the analogy of labor unions, worldly organizations to which thousands of witnesses belong. In contrast with the Red Cross, unions are often engaged in political activity, yet membership is not condemned by the society. 5. As to whether he intended to remain a member of the Red Cross, he stated that from what he could see this was in harmony with the society's publications. He said the question had no meaning unless it were first shown that such membership was incompatible with Christianity. Having received no information to that effect, he saw no conflict of interest. It is worth noting the source of the questions Rudd Person faced. They were supplied to the local elders by the Swedish branch office of the Watchtower Society, and the branch office members stated that they had received direction on the matter from the governing body in Brooklyn. It must be assumed that the information the branch office supplied in its letter to the elders drew upon that governing body direction. It is also worth noting that their information was guilty of numerous misrepresentations, shallow reasoning. The elders transmitted Rudd's replies to the branch office along with a report containing adverse allegations about him, even extending to the school conditions of his children. They did not supply him with a copy, but he was able to obtain one and sent a detailed refutation of each of their allegations to the branch office. Months passed with no word from the branch office. Finally, on April 8, 1987, Rudd phoned the branch office and spoke to two members of the branch office committee, A. Carlson and Rune Gran. Carlson laughingly stated that the organization could not tell the Friends what to do regarding a matter like this. Compare the clear difference between that disclaimer and what the letter which the branch office had sent to the congregation elders actually said. Rune Gran said no action would be taken against Rudd, that the Brooklyn headquarters had indicated that membership in the Red Cross might only have consequences as to a man's holding the office of elder or ministerial servant in the congregation. He likened it to the matter of growing a beard. The footnote reads, "The general policy has been that no action is to be taken where a witness man grows a beard, but that the elders may decide he does not qualify for organizational responsibility." End of footnote. After waiting yet another month for some expression from his local body of elders, Rudd informed his brother, an elder, of his conversation with the men at the branch office. He found that the local elders had never received any reply to their letter to the branch office. To their credit, a few expressed relief on learning what the branch office men had said. Rudd personally found it unbelievable that a professedly Christian organization could resort to these tactics, subjecting persons to such scrutiny and interrogation simply because they felt moved by what they read in Luke, chapter 10 verse 29 to 37 to engage in humanitarian activity. I am inclined to believe that not many witnesses would have felt equipped to present as able a response as was given by this man in Sweden. Had they not, they might well have found themselves facing disfellowshipping action, as having violated their neutrality, based on the organization's completely false claim that the Red Cross performs a large part of its work directly or indirectly in conflict with the thoughts outlined at Isaiah, chapter 2 verse 4. In The Cradle of Democracy, perhaps nothing illustrates more clearly the extremes to which the zeal to spy out and deal summarily with any disagreement or disaffection can go than what happened in Athens, Greece, the land called the Cradle of Democracy. In 1986, the branch office of the Watchtower Society, located in the Athens area, began applying intense pressure on witnesses who gave any indication of not being in total agreement with organizational teachings and policies. The number of those disfellowshipped evidently reached more than 100. In an interest to maintain spirituality, these persons began gathering together for Bible reading and discussion in private homes. The Greek branch office, however, manifested an extreme concern to seek out and take action against any doing so. This in time introduced some remarkable measures and led to a court case described in the Athens newspaper shown on the following page. On Tuesday, April 6, 1987, a group of about 50 persons gathered at the home of Nick and Eftihia Bozartsis for Bible discussion. From his balcony, Nick noticed two men standing across the street watching the individuals entering his home, some of whom had not formally withdrawn from the organization. Recognizing one of the two observers as a witness, he went down to speak to them, but as soon as he appeared on the street level they literally ran off. Within days, 3 of those attending the gathering were disfellowshipped by elders in judicial hearings. On Friday, others normally went to the home of Vula Kalokarinu, a former witness, but since they planned to gather for the celebration of the Lord's evening meal on Sunday, their gathering on Friday, April 9, was cancelled. That Friday evening, however, Vula noticed a car with 5 persons inside parked across the road from her house, and the car and its occupants remained there for hours. The next evening the same. On page 381, the headline on the foot of the picture reads, "Witnesses of video," followed by the statements, "Faithful of Jehovah, who left the organization, in fear of cassettes. We can't even talk to our own children. Many are losing their jobs due to the electronic filing." One might think that to assign any sinister motive to such circumstances, viewing them as evidence of spying designed to identify defectors and supply grounds for judicial action against them, would be the product of imagination, even manifest a degree of paranoia. Later events demonstrated otherwise. The following Sunday, April 11th, a number of persons went to Vula's home to commemorate the death of God's Son on behalf of all mankind. She noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the road on one corner and a van parked on the other corner. The rear window of the van was covered over with paper but with a hole cut in the center of the covering material. The occupants of the car crossed over to the van several times, talking with those inside it. Vula asked one of those who had come to her home to find out why the cars were parked there. When he approached the car, those inside quickly drove off. He then went to the rear of the van and looked in through the hole of the material covering the rear window. Inside he saw video camera equipment being used by two witnesses, an elder named Nicholas Antoniou, and a member of the Athens Watchtower branch office staff, Dimitris Zertes. A number of others from Vula's home came over to the van and a policeman stationed at the nearby Italian embassy also appeared to find out what the problem was. The witnesses in the van managed to drive through the surrounding group and drove to a nearby park where they began quickly unloading their video equipment. They were interrupted by the arrival of two police cars and were arrested on charges of invasion of privacy. The video equipment was confiscated. The film in it showed Mrs. Kalokarina's home and zoom shots of the front entrance with close-ups of all those entering. Before the district attorney, the two men stated that they were only there to film a relative of Dimitris Zertes, the Watchtower branch office member. His cousin, Eftihia Bozartsis, mentioned earlier, had disassociated herself 2 years before. As a loyal witness, branch office member Dimitris should have had no interest in her, certainly should not have had any reason for wanting to film her secretively 2 years after her disassociation. The case eventually came to trial. In his presentation at the close of the trial, the district attorney, Mr. Kontaxis, stated, "I don't think there is any Christian organization that tells its members to tell lies, but when the defendant and his organization does so, I would want them to accept the responsibility and say, yes, we did spy. And if an organization did such a thing, then how can it expect others to follow it? They had and used special equipment with witnesses seeing them filming, and yet the defendant comes along and says he didn't do it to spy but just to film. All this doesn't honor either the defendant or the organization to which he belongs. We are all free to belong to any organization we want, but we are also free to leave that organization and do whatever we want within the bounds of the law. Does a person's leaving, abandoning this organization give it the fight to follow and spy on its members? One is protected by law against cassettes, tape recorders, filming, when such are used to pry into one's personal life and personality. This comes under confidentiality and is protected by it in such cases, and that includes one's private convictions. This is very serious. Obviously the defendants were trying to cryptograph the private life of the plaintiffs by using video equipment, and this purposely, not by chance. The Watchtower Society, by teaching it is the Ark, and that one must enter it to be saved, by teaching it is God's channel, creates tremendous dependency on its members, and thus they are directed to do everything to threaten and trample all that we call human fights. In the course of the trial, one of the judges asked the witness elder, the owner of the van, how long he and the other witness had been stationed in the van that day. The answer was, 6 hours. When asked if the windows of the van were clear, the elder said, no, that the back window was covered with paper with a hole in the center through which they had done filming with the video cassette camera. He claimed that all this was solely to film his companion's relative. The confiscated film showed zoom shots of many persons at the house's front entrance and on its balcony. But the relative did not appear anywhere on the film. Actually, she could not have appeared for the simple reason that she was never at the gathering. The court rendered a guilty verdict in the case. Ironically, the following year, the Awake magazine carried an article decrying the intolerance of Greek Orthodox Church officials, expressed in pressuring officials of a sports stadium to cancel their contract with Jehovah's Witnesses, who were to hold an assembly in the stadium. The footnote reads, "See Awake, November 22, 1988, pages 9 to 11. End of footnote. The article rightly condemned this unjust treatment of peaceful and law-abiding Christians, pointing to the Greek constitutional guarantees of freedom of worship and religious conscience, and citing a court ruling that the freedom of expressing one's religious beliefs is more especially safeguarded by the Treaty of Rome dated April 11, 1950, on the protection of human rights. After saying that the freedom of the Greek people once again has been trampled on because of the Dark Ages mentality of the clergy, the article added, "How sad to see such a flouting of democracy in the cradle of democracy. I can agree with this condemnation of extreme intolerance and bigotry, and I think it is sad that the witnesses experienced this injustice. What I find equally sad, however, is an organization's ability to see injustice when committed by others, to protest against it when practiced toward its own membership in violation of their exercise of freedom of conscience, and yet not be able to see when it itself is guilty of the same thing. The Watchtower organization has never spoken out against the Dark Ages mentality its own representatives manifested in the cradle of democracy by secretive and illegal spying on peaceful and law-abiding Christians who were gathering for the sole purpose of commemorating the death of God's Son. The presence of a branch office staff member in the van used for spying clearly indicates that the branch administration was aware of what was being done and approved or at the very least condoned that action. But the organization does not inform witnesses of this, publishes no expression of condemnation of such practices, and, while witnesses worldwide read of the acts of the Greek Orthodox clergy, none of them outside of Greece would know of the action of Watchtower representatives in that country. To this day, in all countries, any persons among Jehovah's Witnesses who find they cannot conscientiously support fully the organization's teachings or practices live in a climate of fear, feeling they must constantly be on guard as to what they say, what they do, what they read, with whom they associate, from whom they receive letters, not feeling any sense of freedom even when among personal friends or close relatives if these are also witnesses. As stated, in my personal experience I have had people phone who were afraid to give their name or who felt it necessary to use a fictitious name, some who even felt it necessary to take out a special post office box to be able to correspond without danger of their correspondence with me or other former witnesses being discovered. They face a form of hostage situation, produced by the organization's power to cut off all their future communication with family and friends who are subject to the organization's authority. The only way to avoid this is to meet the terms the organization lays down. The picture presented is not overdrawn. The experiences related here are only a small fraction of all that could be given, for an entire book could be filled with them. They exemplify the thinking produced, the attitude developed, by an organization that is willing to use what amounts to thought control to maintain a sterile atmosphere within its membership. Strongly based, solid teachings do not need such a sterile atmosphere, where open discussion is decried as heretical, treasonous, in order to survive. Truth has the strength to confront error. Its validity and worth are in the end enhanced by such confrontations. It is only fragile, weakly supported teachings that are so lacking in powers of resistance that their ability to survive demands being protected from having to endure a testing of their strength. The harsh reality of the situation strikingly reveals the hollowness of public relations statements of the organization, whose representatives, when interviewed by the news media, express difficulty in understanding why anyone would be concerned about reprisals, why it is that persons who cannot agree do not simply leave quietly, who insist that there is no badgering, no emotional harassment, in this very open organization, which is free from spiritual policemen. There are hundreds, thousands of persons who know how contrary to fact those statements are. They know that to express any disagreement, no matter how respectfully made, or to engage in any discussion of a viewpoint that differs with any of the organization's teachings, even in private conversation among close friends, is to invite investigation and trial by a judicial committee. They know that it is almost impossible to withdraw quietly, that the view is, in effect, you cannot quit, we must fire you. Why? Because by so doing the person who has conscientious concerns about the organization's course and teachings is then placed off limits to all other members. There is no danger of these members conversing with such ones and beginning to think about matters that the organization declares to be unthinkable. Unlike the shepherd who would leave the 99 to help one strayed sheep, a shepherd who would patiently and gently treat and nurse a sick sheep, the efforts witness elders make in these situations are often in the form of a confrontation. If scriptures are used at all, it is generally in an accusatory way, not in a healing way. Do you or do you not accept the organization as God's one channel, is virtually always the principal question put, the prime issue on which the results of an interrogation hinge, the criterion by which one's Christianity is judged. The strange situation that results is as if shepherds were to say to a flock, if any of you sheep do not like the way we feed and shepherd you, you are perfectly free to leave. Any who want to go, however, should come to us so that we can first brand you as rejected and spray you with a substance having the odor of wolves, so that the rest of the flock can identify you and avoid you. And please have the decency to leave quietly without any bleeding. Lawlessness of a different kind. God's word serves to expose what might otherwise remain concealed. It reveals the wrongness of those who, like the Pharisees, seemed pure and holy, guiltless according to law, but who merited the strongest denunciations by God's Son for their unkind, unfeeling, superior way. He said that they were like whitewashed tombs. The tombs might look handsome from the outside, but inside all they contained were dead men's bones and uncleanness. The Pharisees' righteousness was superficial, it made them look well to others, but covered over hypocrisy and lawlessness. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 23 verse 27, 28. End of footnote. Stressing that outward appearance and conformity to law prove little as to genuine righteousness, Jesus Christ showed how much deeper the matter goes than what appears on the surface. He warned that adultery can be committed without even touching a woman, through lust in one's heart. His disciple John made plain that one can be a murderer though never having shed anyone's blood, because of murderous hatred in the heart. The Apostle Paul stated that one can be an idolater, though having no literal images for worship, because of being covetous and greedy at heart. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 5 verse 27, 28, 1 John, chapter 3 verse 15, Colossians, chapter 3 verse 5. End of footnote. It seems that Paul had these principles in mind when he wrote these words at Romans, chapter 2 verse 17 to 24, Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, if you know His will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you, then, who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who brag about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. New International Version. I am grateful in a sense for what I have experienced within the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses, and what I experienced within its governing body. I doubt that I would have fully appreciated the value and importance of the Bible teachings in all these regards had it not been for seeing in such a personal way the effect of a legalistic approach to Christianity. I would never have realized how a surface morality can be produced that nonetheless allows for acts that are not only unmerciful but sometimes cruel, extremely so. Now, however, I can realize how it is that the Apostle's words just quoted can apply equally today. I can understand how it is that an organization can claim to be spiritual Israel, formed of Jews in the figurative sense, can proclaim worldwide that it and it alone stands in God's favor, knows His will and law, is His appointed guide to lead people out of darkness into the light of truth, an organization that draws great attention to its making known the name of Jehovah throughout the earth. How it is that such an organization can nonetheless be guilty of a form of lawlessness so serious that it brings grave dishonor on the very name it claims to honor. The problem is not that there is theft of material objects, but things of far greater value are stolen. The fact is that men and women who genuinely love God and His Son and His Word and who have conscientiously dissented from certain organizational law or teachings have been robbed of their proper influence among friends and acquaintances, stripped of their good name and reputation, cheated of the affection and respect that they earned honestly by a whole lifetime of conscientious service to God and to fellow man, have even seen their own families torn away from them. Yet all this has been justified by organizational law. The footnote reads, in one communication from Canada, George Beach, a witness for 20 years but now cut off from his children and grandchildren, said his attitude toward the organization was, "You can steal my house, steal my money, but don't steal my mind, my wife, my children." End of footnote. There has been no bloodshed, no literal murder. Yet sincere and inoffensive men and women who simply sought to hold to conscience have, in effect, been stabbed in the back by unjustified, even malicious, accusations, have undergone character assassination, leaving them as though spiritually dead in the eyes of most of those who knew them. To use the threat of organizational disfellowshipment, with all its consequences, to intimidate people into conforming to a particular policy when their conscience dictates otherwise, or to pressure them to profess belief in a teaching that they honestly believe is contrary to Scripture, is a form of spiritual extortion, spiritual blackmail. To interpose a religious authority center between people and Christ Jesus as a divine channel is to defraud those persons of a spiritual inheritance, an intimate, very personal, relationship with God and His Son that should be rightfully theirs. These things may not be as easy to identify and expose as literal theft, murder, or material fraud and extortion, yet they are equally, in some cases perhaps even more, immoral. They constitute lawlessness of a kind that gravely dishonors the name of God. A regrettable misdirection of zeal among Jehovah's Witnesses. There are hundreds, thousands of persons who need, and would greatly benefit from, upbuilding, healthful aid that would contribute toward their developing the strength and understanding to meet personal problems that seriously affect their lives. As will be discussed in a later chapter, while there is much boasting of the spiritual paradise supposedly found within the international organization, a survey of most congregations would reveal that witnesses as a collective society are in no way free from the social stress and problems affecting people in general. The large files at the Watchtower's Brooklyn headquarters contain abundant evidence of this, and their volume grows with each passing year. Much is made of the policy of disfellowshipping unrepentant wrongdoers as proof of concern for maintaining a clean organization. Simply to amputate offending members of a body, however, is no sign of overall health and certainly no proof of curative powers. There are definitely elders among the witness community who feel moved to give personal attention and remedial help that might avoid any call for punitive action, or to give simply the kind of Christian encouragement and comfort that so many need. There are elders who feel that they can rightly take the time for doing so, and who are equipped spiritually and scripturally to supply such help. The truly regrettable fact is that such elders are so rare. The system itself, its view of itself, and the spirit that results, simply do not favor this kind of person. The criteria for selecting elders gives virtually no consideration to the desirable qualities described, focusing largely on how active candidates are, not in giving kind help to others, but in the organization's programs. As a result, most elders are or have become merely organization men, concerned only with following the organization line, with much prodding of the sheep to follow that line, but with only perfunctory help and very little in the way of comfort or refreshment. Their role has been converted by a religious system from that of spiritual shepherds to spiritual taskmasters. The failure to recognize the scriptural truths that Christian salvation is not predicated on some program of works, that Christian deeds must be spontaneously motivated by faith and love and not by external pressures, and that Christians are not under law but under God's undeserved kindness, it is this failure that lies at the root of the problem. I do not question the sincerity of many of these men. Actually, a growing number of witness elders have been moved by conscience to resign their eldership. The evidence is that the organization is losing many of its more compassionate men, and the long-term effects of this will not be healthful. In many congregations, more and more comparatively young men are becoming elders, and often the resulting situation proves like that in biblical times, when King Rehoboam received wise counsel for moderation from older men but preferred to go with that of younger men who favored a tough, authoritarian stance. The footnote reads, 1 Kings, chapter 12 verse 3 to 16. End of footnote. Similarly, as regards many of those congregation members who, because of holding to organizational norms, have coldly cut off former friends and even family members from fellowship, doing this even where they knew that the only sin of such ones was their inability to accept conscientiously certain teachings or practices as scriptural, I am sure that many do this with deep pain. Here, too, there are those who eventually begin to ask themselves if their course is really exemplary of the attitude of God's Son. In 1985, a couple in Maine, who had left hippie life to become witnesses, wrote of their being attracted to the organization because of its apparent warmth and openness. They auxiliary pioneered frequently, gave their 100% in all respects, so that, as their letter states, we soon realized our home was nothing more than a motel room, a place to rush to after the long drive home from meetings, and a place to grab a bite in before rushing off to drop the kids at school and go out in service. Yet none of this disturbed them. What did were experiences of a different kind. As the wife writes, the first was a situation out in service. A sister witness and I visited a dying witness in the hospital. A well-dressed younger man happened to be there to visit also, so we spoke with him. It turned out that he was the man's son and a former witness. In our brief, needless to say, conversation with him, he mentioned that he'd simply had some questions that he wanted answered, and that after several sessions, trying to get answers, had been disfellowshipped. This was in 1981. What amazes me now, looking back, is that all the sister and I were really concerned about was that we stopped speaking to him very quickly, as we were supposed to. I didn't even think of how he must have felt about his dying father. Her husband, Kim, found himself forced to reassess his views by an experience with a Polish witness who had been in concentration camps during World War II. She asked him if she could speak to him after one congregational meeting. The letter relates, she began crying soon after we started talking. She rode to work every morning with her disfellowshipped son, and with all the new understanding the Society's 1981 more rigid policy toward disfellowshipped persons, she was having a wretched time with her relationship with him. Another son was an elder in our congregation and took a hard line, and yet another son was dying of cancer. The thought of rejecting the disfellowshipped son was just more than she could bear. My husband Kim later commented that if an organization were really teaching the love that Christ taught us we should have, an occasion like that would never have arisen, because there was no compassion in it. Once a judicial hearing produces a verdict for disfellowshipping, the organizational policy in effect calls on all witnesses, even though having no knowledge of what was said in the secret hearing, to participate in a figurative stoning of the one condemned, treating him as though dead as long as he is in the disfellowshipped state. I would think that any person having genuine respect for the heavenly judge and his son, before whose judgment seat we must all eventually appear, would think seriously about their individual responsibility when called on to cast their personal stone, particularly if they have any question in their hearts as to the condemned one's being truly a wicked person. Having been through the experience of such stoning myself, I believe I can understand how many feel. And yet, I believe that our own respect for our superior judges, God and Christ, as well as our own compassion and humility, can temper whatever sense of resentment we might feel. It may well cause us to take up the words of God's Son and of his disciple Stephen and say with them, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. The footnote reads, Luke, chapter 23 verse 34, Acts, chapter 3 verse 14 to 17, 7 verse 60. End of footnote. It is not that congregational elders or those who are simply members have no responsibility before God for their actions. They do, and it is a responsibility they cannot pass on to an organization and its leaders. But the degree of blindness affecting them is something we cannot know, something only the heavenly reader of hearts can determine. I personally prefer to embrace that outlook. I find life happier as a result. End of chapter 11.